this event is part of our bigger Tracking Progress project, which is in partnership with the Moore Foundation. And really the goal of this program is to do a horizon scan of the movement ecology space and look at where investment is needed to catapult the field forward in terms of questions that we can ask and innovation that's needed. We have 4 events in this series, and it'll be followed by 4 closed smaller focus group discussions. And the 4 events we're covering 4 big picture topics. The first one, which was 2 weeks ago, and the recording's now up on YouTube, covered data collection. Today, we're talking about data analysis. In 2 weeks, we'll be talking about data sharing and archiving. And a month from now, we'll be talking about big picture future questions and tools. So we're trying to get a full picture of the field. Now, just to give you a reminder, if you weren't here last time, we're trying to encourage the conversation to think about, and all of our speakers and the project to think about looking at the future in two different areas. The first one, we're thinking about, where can we get on this? The first one's the second horizon thing. It's where can we get if we just sorry, let me gather my thoughts. We're thinking about 2 horizons. One is, if we just throw money and knowledge and time at something, where can we get with just brute force? And we kind of know where the innovation can go, and the pathway is pretty clear. We just need the resources in place to get there. The other area where we're thinking about, and we're really trying to encourage the conversations to get to, and we're trying to delve into, is this kind of third horizon, the blue sky thinking about, where can we actually get that? We don't quite know how to get there yet. Like, what are the different questions that we can ask? What is the innovation that could get us to these different visions of the future? And part of the reason why we're really interested in this second area, this further along blue sky horizon, is that, last year in our state of conservation tech research, which was looking at the big picture, the whole field of conservation tech, we talked to a lot of different experts, and it was really interesting to hear how many different perspectives there were about the future and where we could be going with technology and the questions and the impact that we could have with our technologies applied to conservation. So we want to create spaces where we can hear from all of these different experts and hear these different pictures of what the future could look like. And part of the reason why we've pulled together these particular speakers for this whole series is that they represent very different perspectives and experience, and are exploring different avenues for movement ecology at different scales, different technologies, and different innovations. So we hope you really enjoy this series and learn about research you didn't know what was happening, technology and innovation you didn't know what was on the horizon, and we can just have some really interesting conversations. Yeah, that's my one final important housekeeping thing is a consent piece. Because this is a research project that we're doing in partnership with Colorado State University, we do have ethics approval. So I just need to read this out so everyone is aware of this information. This event is part of a larger research project we're running with Colorado State University and supported by the Moore Foundation, and it's conducting a horizon scan of tech in movement ecology. The event is being recorded and will be shared publicly and used to inform future elements of our research. And by staying on this call, you're consenting to participate in the discussion and this project. If you have questions, please contact Talia or Jennifer. Right, I think that's it from me. I'm going to hand to our first speaker, who is Sara Beery, who is also one of our advisory group on this project. We have an advisory group of some amazing experts who have joined us as the first speaker on each of our talks in this series. So Sara, I'm going to hand over to you. But while you're getting set up, I'm going to read a little introduction to who you are, so people who don't know, who haven't met you before, have a bit of background. So feel free to get your slides up. So to introduce Sara, she is a final year, Zoom, I swear. Sorry, Sara is a final year PhD candidate in computer and mathematical science at Caltech. She's actually defending next Friday, 9 a.m. Her research focuses on building computer vision methods that enable global scale biodiversity monitoring. She's a leading voice in the wild labs and conservation communities, working hard to make AI accessible to conservationists. And she's also a member of our advisory committee for the Tracking Progress project. She'll be providing a brief introduction to the topic today ahead of our other speakers. Sara, do you want to take over?
Yeah, thank you, Stephanie, for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes, can hear you, but can everyone see Sara's slide? Because I can't.
This is no here.
Okay, good. There you go. You're good.
Yeah. Google does this thing where it sort of like unpins if you're not paying attention for long enough. But if you move the slides, it pins it back to the top. Yeah, so I'm basically planning to just talk about kind of the space of data analysis, but at a high level, and really try to introduce some of the large challenges and like open questions that there are in the field. But I'm leaving the digging deep into the methods for the other speakers. So really just trying to give a reasonably high level intro. And mostly focused on some of the big challenges that we face when we're sort of trying to do data analysis, but really scale up in many different dimensions. So I think the first important point is that movement ecology is both young, but growing exponentially. This is a figure from a paper just a couple of years ago that's showing significant exponential growth in the number of articles that are submitted around movement ecology each year. And in my opinion, a huge amount of this growth actually can be attributed to the substantial and really worthwhile efforts of the community to try to build open access and open standards for sharing movement data, through things like MoveBank, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. But one of the things that comes with scale usually is growing pains, one way or another. And I think that there are a couple different interesting challenges of scale when we talk about movement ecology. So the first one is on the large side, large scale. So this is a visualization from MoveBank that's showing all of the different movement data that is in this amazing centralized platform. And if you look at the numbers, MoveBank, as of earlier this year, had 3.5 billion animal locations, 3.6 billion other animal-borne sensor measurements. That's everything from, audio monitors on the collars, sometimes images, lots of different types of data, lots of diversity of data that's in this central platform. Over 6,900 studies. So just showing the breadth of the different research groups that are actively interested in using this type of data, and 1,178 different taxa. And so as you start to move up to the scale of billions of data points with this much diversity and this many different projects, which often means different types of sensors, different sampling rates, different accuracies, and with different taxa, the challenges of understanding how to combine information across these studies with some of the sampling biases that might be in effect. I think that that's where we really end up needing some really careful statistical methods and the development of new methods that can actually be computationally efficient at these scales. And then I think one of the other really challenging aspects of scale when you talk about movement ecology is actually the fact that in some dimensions, it's truly small scale. And here, what I'm talking about is the fact that with most of these GPS tracked signals, what you're getting is movement of a single animal of a species, or maybe a set of animals of a species. But in order to get that data, you have to go and actually place sensors on animals. And that's invasive. It's expensive. For example, I work a lot with the Mara Elephant Project, and every elephant collar costs them about $25,000. It's dangerous. In order to collar animals, I have a friend who has to lean out of helicopters flying through forests trying to shoot tranquilizers at wolves. This is not a safe thing for humans to be doing. And it's also temporary. There's no such thing yet as sensors that actually are able to run continuously without running out of power running out of data, like dealing with data bandwidth issues, and also trying to figure out how to store and recover some of this data. And so movement ecology is both challenging from a large scale perspective, but also a small scale perspective. And I don't think it would be reasonable to expect that we're ever going to get to the point where we have collars on every single animal that exists on Earth. And so when you talk about these interesting dimensions of small scale, that's where you actually start running into these common problems with generalizability when you are thinking about processes for automating data analysis. So one way that we can think about the generalizability of data analysis is actually generalizing things like behavior categorization from movement data to new individuals within a population. So there are studies that are actually looking at individual preferences or habits in the types of behavior that's exhibited. And it is definitely the case that if you build behavior categorization for a track from a single individual in a species, there's not a guarantee that that method will not somehow overfit to that specific animal's behavior. And so we have to be very careful when we think about how generalizable the methods are, even within a single type of species, just elephants, for example, to being quite robust to then working off the shelf when we put a collar on a new individual. There's also generalizability challenges when we think about generalizing to new species. This is a really beautiful figure from a recent paper by Walter Yetz's group. And what you can see is that the types of movement data that we get from different species are very different. And this has to do with what's possible to put on a species. You can't put the same sort of power and bandwidth capacity on something that's going onto a bird because it needs to be quite lightweight. So these differences in what's actually possible for the sensor platforms themselves, the hardware, introduces some challenges generalizing to new species. But then also, what is feeding behavior from movement data for species across the board? What we don't really want when we think about economies of scale is for us to need to build a huge labeled, human ground truth labeled training data set over 100 different collared individuals of every species to be able to recognize behavior for that species in a robust way. So how do we actually share information across this movement data for different species to get to systems that are more easily adaptable and generalizable? And then the final dimension of generalizability is actually generalizing to new tasks. Many researchers have different questions they want to ask with this data. And so, if you're interested in behavior, which I think many people are, that means different things depending on your research question. You're interested, and some people are interested in more complex behaviors. So not just, is this animal at this time resting or eating, but things like, how are animals learning over time? Can you actually get at these sort of second order behaviors, things like learning to avoid human populations, for example? And also, can we learn to predict animal behavior? So actually look into the future. And these types of, these are just two examples of hundreds of different potential tasks, potential types of information we might want to extract from this really rich repository of data. And so there's this other question of, how do we build methods that are easily adaptable also to new tasks? Because I think all of us are aware that we have limited resources. So we're not going to be able to build, massive training data sets for every potential task. Another big challenge is just data quality. When you talk about all of these different types of sensors, they all have different types of errors that can be incurred. And I really liked this example of just different ways that people incorporate data cleaning into their processing pipelines. And you need to be sure that your method is somehow not overfitting to a specific type of data noise that might occur. Another really interesting and open challenge, I think, in this space is how do we incorporate additional information we might have beyond just this time series, geospatial signal. So that can be stuff like covariates, environmental factors that might actually play a large role in something like forward prediction or behavior analysis. Things like social information. For social species, if you actually have a sparse number of individuals that are tracked, but you understand something about the social network, what can that tell you about the movement of the population as a whole? And also non-invasive methods of tracking, things like visual re-identification for populations, where now potentially you might be able to get tracking signal for individuals you don't need to collar. But of course, that's going to be more sparse because you don't, unless you, I guess, fly a drone around behind a zebra, which is probably not going to be a long-term sustainable solution. And then finally, I think there's a lot of interest in moving to real-time analysis. It's great if you collect, hundreds of thousands of data points from an individual. Somehow you go and get that data off the collar, maybe with some bandwidth limitations. But especially for at-risk populations, you'd like to know, for example, when an elephant is under stress, so that you could actually, actively intervene and try to mitigate human-wildlife conflict or poaching. And there has been some recent interest in building TinyML, edge-based machine learning for spatiotemporal data, collars that are actually doing analysis in real time locally on device. And then you can kind of make optimal bandwidth decisions about what information you send. But again, now we need to figure out how to take these models and actually compress them and build them in ways that are accessible on the edge. And then, my final plug, which is basically something that I feel like I'm always proselytizing in this community, is that there is no such thing as a method that should just be trusted after it works well on a benchmark data set. So all of these things need validation and quality control. If you build a system that's recognizing behavior for a specific time period, you need to have a plan from the beginning for how you're going to make sure that that model is still valid next year and the year after. And if it starts to drift, if you start to see that there are inaccuracies that are building up due to correlations you learned in the first place that are no longer true in a changing world, then we need methods for actually adapting those models on the fly efficiently so that we still are building with human AI together trustworthy systems for analysis of this very large scale data. And if you're actually developing AI methods or using AI methods for movement data, I'm just plugging that we have an AI for Conservation Slack community that's a really great place to have big discussions about the nitty-gritty details of like what data you're using, the methods you're using, any questions you might have. So if you are interested in joining that community, it's close to 1,000 researchers globally now who do AI methods for ecology. You can email aiforconservation@gmail.com. And I stole basically every single picture in this intro. So these are the people you get who you should be giving credit to for all the visuals. Awesome. Yeah, really looking forward to the talks from the different speakers.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Sarah. That was superb. You really set the scene and kind of took a really good punt at that third horizon of questions and like how we're going to get there. I'm going to hand over to our next speaker. Samaya, do you want to try and get your talk up while I do a little introduction? Sure. Okay. Samaya Dodge is an assistant professor in spatial data science and the director of the Move Lab at UC Santa Barbara. We invited Samaya to share her experience in dynamic movement data visualization and modeling in both human and natural systems, which have made important contributions to our ability to model complex issues like human-wildlife conflicts, environmental change, natural hazards, spread of diseases, mobility, and global migration. So we're really excited to hear from you and learn more about your work and hear what your visions for the future are. Do you want to take over now?
Sure. Do you see the presentation or the presenter? Okay.
Presentation, it's perfect.
Okay, well, thanks so much for having me, and thanks, Stephanie, for the nice introduction. I'm glad that Sara went before and basically covered most of the things so I don't have to go into depth about the general picture, but overall, so my name is Samaya Dodge, and I'm at UC Santa Barbara, and I work at the intersection of movement analytics in both human systems and ecological systems. I should admit my background is geographic information science and spatial data science. So I'm not an ecologist, but I work with ecologists. And in my work, I basically do a data-driven analysis and modeling. And also here, I specifically would like to advocate for a human-centered approach towards converging human mobility analytics and animal ecology methods. So as we all know, both humans and animals are being tracked everywhere, and we can use these signals to understand the behavior of both animals and humans and their interaction with their environment and with one another in these complex systems. In spatial data science or movement data science, we basically start with the data to develop data-driven analytics and machine learning techniques to understand behavior of individual, understand movement. So going from data to behavior and use this knowledge to improve our modelings and maybe even add to theory. Here, collaboration between data owners, domain scientists, and method developers is key to develop successful and meaningful methods that can be applied to both domains. So this framework, in this framework, visualization and visual analytic tools could be very helpful in interdisciplinary collaboration to bring together scientists together and basically communicate patterns that are hidden in the data. The success of this framework depends on how it can enable humans for working with these tools with AI and machine learning to for a better knowledge discovery and more meaningful knowledge discovery. Basically, the tools that we develop should facilitate disciplinary collaboration and optimize human input in the process. And only us as the analyst or the human in the loop can control for the bias in the data and look at how we can control the bias in our algorithms. And also other things that we need to be mindful about. Sorry, this doesn't work, it seems. It's basically creating tools that encourages and facilitates collaboration and communication by taking advantage of visualization. So through this presentation, I would like to show some of my work that basically follows this framework and applies develop methods that bring in human in the picture, and also the methods could be applied to both domains of human mobility and movement analytics. So first of all, in my group, we realized that we need to first create a tool that we can map the data to understand or discover patterns and maybe even use it as a hypothesis generation tool and basically interact with the data. So we developed this open source exploratory data visualization tool called DynamoVis, which is available through MoveMind website, and also we publish it in Movement Ecology. So the tool is flexible enough that you can use your tracking data and map it the way you want by changing the variables. So Sara mentioned additional factors that like environmental variables that you want to explore the associations with movement to movement. So basically you can map them using different visual variables of color, size of the tracking data, or shape of the tracking data. Next, I will give you an example that is that captures that better. But in general, the tool gives you flexibility without any need for programming to map data both in 2D and in 3D, although the 3D is not yet released, and map environmental variable over your tracking data. So as an example here, I show a visualization that animates tracking data of albatrosses, Galapagos albatrosses that they forage at the coast of Peru, and their nest is in Galapagos. So here the size of the dots shows how fast the bird was moving or flying, and the greenness shows how, the amount of food availability captured by OceanNet primary production. So as you can see, you're using visual variable size and color. We are capturing the association between speed of the movement and the greenness of the ocean, or food availability in the ocean. And to capture how this movement is assisted by wind, here this visualization uses a visual variable line with different sizes showing different speed. Narrow lines shows slower speed, and thicker lines show faster speed, and their color shows how much wind was helping this bird. So the albatrosses straying into headwind is captured by narrower red lines, and when they are helped by wind, you see blue and thicker lines, and that shows that on the flight after foraging back to Galapagos, these birds use wind assessment. So next, I would like to focus on interaction analysis. So there have been a lot of methods to capture interaction in moving individuals, or in dynamic systems. In geography, we focus a lot on spatial interaction, how individuals interact in space, and but also dynamic interaction, meaning that over time, how individuals interact with each other. This animation shows tracking data of two tigers in both the geographic projection, 2D, the two-dimensional projection, and 3D, the space-time cube. So the time goes vertically upward. So as you can see, these two tigers come sometimes close to each other, and sometimes they move parallel to each other. So we were interested to look at not only concurrent interactions, but which means that they moved closely at the same time in space. And delayed, we wanted to also look at delayed interaction. So which is basically if the individuals visited the same location with a time lag, or followed each other's path with a time lag. So the issue of a scale that Sara nicely mentioned, talked about the general aspect of a scale. Here, I want to focus only on resolution, the problem of resolution and mismatch of resolution in the data set. So when we capture movement at different resolutions, the sampling rate that we use to capture movement impacts our analysis. So for example, here I'm showing that how movement speed is impacted by changing the sampling interval from 3 seconds to all the way to 1800 seconds. And although this is not animal movement, human movement, but that also is generalizable to animal movement. And the path tortuosity is also very much impacted by the resolution we capture our data. So another important aspect of mismatch of resolution, or using coarse resolution to capture movement, is that you might miss interaction points. Like when the two animals come into close contact, we might miss them if we have a mismatch of resolution or a coarse resolution. So to to somewhat help this problem, we developed a time geographic approach to interaction analysis. So in time geography, which was first, this framework was first introduced by Hagstrand, you model the locations that are accessible to an individual during a time budget with an ellipse, or basically if you consider the space-time path, the space-time cube, the areas that are accessible in space and time to an individual is modeled using the time geography framework, which indicates that, for example, if you have two tracking data, like at time A and B, two tracking or sampling points, the areas that are accessible to the individual between the two sampling points based on the speed of the individual and the time that the time of these two sampling points, what is the accessible location to this area, which then can be used to identify potential areas for interaction. So we call that accessible area a potential path area. So if we compute the potential path area along the tracking data of different individuals and intersect them together, then we can identify areas for potential areas for interaction. And then when we put them in sequences and compute the duration of continuously intersected areas, then we can identify or compute the duration of interaction. So in this paper, we developed the method and applied it to both human movement data and animal tracking data. So here you see the outcomes applied on 3 tracking data of 2 tigers. The home range is shown red and green, and the blue shows a leopard that shares home range with these 2 tigers. And this tracking data is obtained in Western Forest Complex in Thailand through my collaborator, David Smith. So we looked at not only the intersection between their potential path areas, but also the delay that we could detect in the intersection. So like, for example, a leopard, a tiger goes to a location, and with a delay, a leopard or another tiger goes to the same location. And if you notice here, some of the tracking data has different resolution. So parts of the tracking data is 20 minutes resolution, and parts of it is like 1 hour resolution. And basically, if you look at the delay in interaction, you see that the leopard tends to stay away from tigers, both tigers, but shares come close to contact with the green tiger often, because the home range of the leopard is completely within the home range of the tiger. And then the 2 tigers basically have a delay interaction starting from about 3 hours that takes about up to 2 weeks. They go and check out the location of the other tiger, that perhaps for scent marking. So, and if you look at the duration of interaction computed with these 2 different methods, so here we are using human movement data because we had the travel survey data that we could validate the duration of interaction when people were moving together and stayed together, and then people just interacting together. So we had information about that. So the potential path area, as you can see here, by changing the resolution, at the 1 minute sampling interval, it's fairly comparable to what you get from diary data or travel surveys. But the proximity-based approach, which is basically computing point-to-point distances between the 2 trajectories, fails to capture a lot of this interaction. And when you make the sampling rate coarser, proximity-based approach becomes completely invalid, and the potential path area overestimates the duration of contact because the size of ellipses become larger. So, and the other graph, the grayscale graph shows where if the individuals were moving together or individuals were randomly coming into contact together. So individuals within the same household and individuals outside household. So individuals within the same households were tracked together. You can see those basically with darker gray, and individuals outside household are lighter gray. So for individuals who weren't tracked together, we can see that the proximity-based approach even cannot detect any interaction or contact. However, the potential path area is capable of doing so, but the numbers are overestimated when the sampling interval increases. So to end this talk, I would like to shift the focus towards COVID and capturing human movement throughout the COVID pandemic. So starting with the pandemic, a lot of companies started to share their data. As you can see here, they come in different formats, different resolution, both spatially and temporally. Some of them are freely available, some of them are commercial data sets. So these data have been used a lot in not only modeling the spread of COVID, but also looking at the impact of non-pharmaceutical intervention for ordering shelter in place or limiting mobility throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. But also, as you know, the community, the movement ecology community started using human mobility as an indicator of, or as the two corresponded with a human animal activity to look at the relationship between the two, whether they impact movement of each other in terms of increasing activity or lowering activity, less activity due to activity of the other. A lot of papers that were used for focused on looking at human movement impact in response to COVID, they mainly use one or two or multiple sources of this data. Here we wanted to show, first of all, we wanted to look at how representative these data sets are in United States. We only focused in the United States, and then also looking at different patterns that we identified with this data set. So here you can see we are correlating the population at each county with the user base of some of these data sets, because not all share the number of their user base. So only PlaceIQ, the Scarlet Lab, SafeGraph, and Cubic share their user base. So as you can see here, the population, so we would expect that all these dots, which each one represent one county in the United States, would line up in the regression line. However, in larger metro areas, in counties that represent larger metro area, we see an underrepresentation, meaning that this mobility data do not capture the exact mobility of the population. They might not capture the exact mobility of the population well in larger metro areas. Next, we looked at the spatial and temporal coverage. Here, the color, the intensity of the color shows if we had complete data for an entire year. I think here was 2020. In all counties and in all calendar dates. So as you can see, so on the left, you see the calendar view, and on the right, you see the geographic view. So there are a lot of missing data and gaps in the data set. So if you are using Google data or Facebook data, you might not be capturing the entire mobility throughout the space, and both spatially and temporally. And finally, we were interested to look at what patterns we can identify with this data set. So we applied local indicators of a spatial association to look at clusters, identify clusters. So as this animation move forward, I know it's very difficult to see the patterns, but we are using two different data sets, Cubic as a commercial source and SafeGraph as an open source data that you can get for free. The hotspots represent high values where closer to, high values are clustered like counties that have high values near to other counties that have high values, and cold spots are the other way. So lower values of mobility clustered with other lower values. So if you look at these two graphs, like on the left, you see mobility, like travel distance. So these are distance-based measured, and on the right, you see percentage-based measures, which are like the percentage of population sheltered in place, stayed at home. So we see some hotspot and cold spot that during the year overlap, but also a lot of discrepancies and differences between the two data sets, and also between the two indicators as well. So to summarize these patterns, because the animation is very hard to detect patterns, we looked at an aggregated measure view of these data sets. So each dot represents a county, and the transparency of the color shows whether they were more recent cold spots and hot spots, and older cold spot and hot spots, meaning that at the beginning of the 2020 or at the end of the year. And then the size of the dots represent the number of weeks a county stayed as a hot spot and cold spot. If you just look at this aggregated view, which we actually developed a tool for representing these structures, so you can go to the GitHub page and play with the tool. You can zoom in different counties and in different states, and look at variation in different states as well. So if you, yes.
Sorry, just to jump in, we're running quite over time here. So
sorry.
I want to jump ahead to the
to summarize, the patterns that we get are very different in these two data sets. And with that, I would like to thank you.
Sorry to wrap.
No worries. My computer shows 8 minutes, so I thought I have 2 more minutes for some reason.
No, that was a oh, sorry, it just started pouring here, so I'm sorry if the sound's bad. That was fantastic, and the visualizations were amazing. They have such applications for, like, I mean, research aside, just communication and understanding is superb. If there are questions, do you guys want to drop them in the chat, and Samaya can pick up specific questions while we move on to Christen, who I'm going to do a little introduction for. Thank you so much, Samaya. That was wonderful. Christen Fleming is a fellow at the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute's Conservation Ecology Center. We've invited Chris here as an expert on mathematical models, statistical analysis, and software packages for difficult to work with ecological data. And he's made enormous contributions to big data challenges in movement ecology. So we're really looking forward to hearing from him. So Chris, do you want to take it away? You are still muted.
I'm sorry, I apologize. Thank you for having me. Yeah, so I want to talk about the statistical challenges in analyzing animal movement data. And so where I fit in this story is that a lot of you guys like to go out and collect tracking data on species that you're interested in. And these data are exploding exponentially for various reasons, including Moore's law and lithium-ion battery and GPS, and the fact that no one ever wants to go back to paper maps in their cars. And when you take this kind of data, I develop statistical models and methods and software so that you can turn this into something really rigorous in the output. And you can do that without having to know how to solve a stochastic differential equation or knowing what a stochastic differential equation is, even though that's really what's happening in the background. And so I want to motivate a little bit, why that level of math would be necessary for analyzing tracking data, just very briefly. So you get data that are location estimates with timestamps, say if you're collecting GPS data. And since the locations are sampled discretely in time, the easiest way to analyze these data are with discrete time methods, which you could think about like connect the dot methods. And there are a lot of issues with this, including scale dependence, which has been touched on a little bit today. So if you were to get speeds estimates from this, you'd be assuming that your animal moves in straight lines from one point to the next, which it didn't really do. So the easy models are discrete time models, but the truth is continuous time. And you have some really sparse, possibly erroneous sample of that. So in continuous time stochastic process models, you don't assume to have the truth. You could have a lot of possible trajectories that the animal took, and many would be consistent with the data. And this is necessary to get meaningful estimates and predictions in a lot of cases. So the biggest thing I've worked on is space use estimation or home range estimation. So this is some black bear data. And on the left is a conventional estimate of where the black bear you expect to be 95% of the time in the future. And on the right is the same kind of estimate, but where I rederive this statistical method to leverage a formally selected stochastic process model. And it's way different. The one on the left assumes you have independently sampled data. The one on the right does not. It assumes a movement model. And this is only the first half of the data. And so if you cross-validate in the future and you ask, are these methods predictive? The conventional method is not predictive. It's not useful at all in this case. Whereas my method, you might have thought it was way too big. It's actually a little bit too small when you look at the cross-validation. And so that's why this level of math is necessary, because these tracking data are really complicated time series data. And these stochastic process models can solve a lot of the issues with them, scale dependence. If you had one system, you tracked at 30-minute intervals, and another, you tracked at 1 hour. It doesn't really care about those kind of things. One tracking device, another kind of tracking device, different location error. It can solve all, not every issue, but a lot of issues can be solved with this framework. Things I'm working on right now. One thing I'm working right now is habitat suitability model. And so this is a taper home range estimate, and it's informed by the taper's selection of tree cover. So this is both a home range estimate and this is a habitat suitability or a resource selection model all together in one. You almost never see people do both of those at the same time, but the only thing that's really stopping you is the right kind of tools, because they're really related tasks. And the things I'm working on right now that I have up and running, and if you've ever done like a habitat suitability or a resource selection kind of analysis, there's all these weird questionable statistical issues in this. What do you do about the fact that your data are autocorrelated and these methods are really not built for that? Picking an available area and the fact that your outputs are sensitive to that choice, that seems pretty arbitrary. How many random points do you sample? So I just went through, these are some of the things that I've solved essentially, where you don't have to get into the mud and everything's just kind of cleaned up and done right by getting down to the statistical weeds. Another thing I've been working on is population estimates. So these tracks are individuals, and then with a hierarchical model, making inferences about the population. That's not new, but doing it computationally fast and statistically efficient and easy in software. So I'm a lead developer in the continuous time movement modeling package, and all these analyses I'm showing you come out of that package. Doing that gives you a lot that you can do. So for instance, if you have a bunch of tracked individuals and talking about their population range, conventionally people would take a bunch of coverage areas, a bunch of individual home range area polygons, and they would just merge them all together and they'd say, that's my population range. But you can do something much more rigorous like this, where you can actually get a population distribution with some uncertainty estimates. And another thing, when you have this kind of stuff in place, is you can start thinking about integrating individual tracking data with population data, like eBird, for instance. And the promise that that brings is that that the tracking data could potentially mitigate it against these presence-only data and their sampling biases that you get from the fact that you tend to observe birds where people tend to make observations, whereas tracking data follows the animals around in all kinds of places. And then in the future, so those are the things I'm working on at the moment, but 5-10 years out, or the things I think are really important and need to be tackled. So I talked mostly about GPS and VHF and Argos type data, but there's other kinds of data that are really important too, like detector array data. Like there are around the ocean, like here around Florida, both coasts in North America, all around Australia, and in a lot of lakes around the world, in the UK and in the Great Lakes. There's detector array data where you just get a detection event if your tag critter gets near a receiver. And that's a much more complicated kind of data than like GPS data, but it is movement data. And the same thing in North America and growing in Western Europe, this new modus wildlife, small birds, small migratory birds. These you can tag, it's much smaller than GPS tags on your critters, and if they get near a detector, you have an event. And also camera trap data. If you can identify individuals and you have a network of camera traps, that's movement data too. And these are all really similar. And it's possible to build the tools, the models exist. It's possible to build the tools so that people can analyze these kinds of data and get the same things out that people get out with GPS data. It just takes some investment of time and resources to build that software infrastructure. Another big thing I think super important is corridor estimation for lots of reasons, because protecting corridors are really important. There's lots of money going into like wildlife crossings. There's a lot of money and lives lost in wildlife vehicle collisions. I think more Americans die every year from wildlife vehicle collisions and tornadoes, and more money as well lost. But this is like really early, the stuff people are doing. It's really heuristic. We don't even have the appropriate target distributions yet that are really being estimated. The models that are being used are not exactly what you would think of for migratory. It's usually like Brownian motion, which doesn't, if you simulate from the models that are being used, it doesn't really look like a migration. And you're missing population variance most of the time too. So there's just a whole lot of cleanup and work that could be done in this area that I think a ton of people would appreciate. And just for small things, I could list a whole bunch of things and go into any of these topics in a ton, but like integrating accelerometer and tracking data could benefit a lot of different ways in terms of behavioral modeling, in terms of battery life efficiency. I talked about these detector array kind of data, and there's some work that can be done to get those up to speed with like GPS type data. The same can be said of light level geolocator data for small migratory birds. A lot of work's been done on that, but more work could be done to get that up to speed, where you could just feed that in like it's any other kind of data, and just maybe the computer time's 10 times longer or whatever, but you could still get out all the kinds of things that you want. And also resource selection models. So I think, I'm working on this, but there's a whole lot more to do there in terms of like continuous time resource selection models. That's like a whole talk there. And there's just a ton of things. And my closing thoughts are that there's just a whole bunch of statistical challenges because these are really complex data. And but there's so much more information to squeeze out of these data. Not only like future data, these data are accumulating exponentially, but just the data we already have, there's a lot more in there. And I think what there needs to be is it's a combination of research and then making sure everything gets implemented in software. Because the level of math that's required for a lot of these things, you gotta have it implemented in easy to use software. That just has to be what needs to be done. The research alone I don't think is going to cut it. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. That was super interesting. We hear a lot at least in our circles about integration of technologies being like the big emerging challenge and like area of focus, and don't often hear as much about the integration of data sets and from the statistical perspective that you're talking about. So thank you for that. We have quite a few questions for you. I'll kick off with reading out some from people without mics. Neil asks, an easy one, where do we find the tools to run these analyses?
Yeah, so the package I developed is called CTMM, and it's on CRAN, and there's a development version on GitHub that has all these resource selection function features I showed. Those are in the development version on GitHub. And then if you haven't learned R, or if you're like a manager that's never going to learn R, we also have a point and click CTMM web that you can use, and it's a GUI kind of tool, and it has all the main things in there for space use estimation and speed estimation and whatnot.
Point and click got some nods. Second question, do you think we could inform stochastic movement process between GPS locations with other sensors on the animal, like accelerometers and heart rate monitors, to be able to derive the most probable complete track?
Yeah. So I think that's one of the big things you can do. And what you need for that is you need continuous acceleration models, which you don't need for GPS data because they're not, even with like 1 Hertz GPS data, you just don't need that. But you do need those for the accelerometer data. And you need behavioral switching models, because animals shift between different, movement behaviors or gaits. And when you have those two ingredients, and then you integrate those two data sources together, you can get much more accurate estimates of where the animal is moving and what its movement behavior was at the time. And you can do all kinds of stuff with that, including getting really, really high precision estimates of where the animal's going.
Awesome. Rob, do you want to jump in?
Is it me, Rob?
Yeah.
Hi, Christen. Thanks for the talk, and thanks everyone for those great talks. I have a million questions actually for everybody, but my question was in your graph where you showed the territory that you had mapped for the bear, mm-hmm. and you showed you had some cross-validation data. I just wanted to clarify that's actually real GPS data, yep, from that bear, right, that you used. Yeah, so your model actually, as you said, was maybe a little small. And I love the comparison with the classical or conventional model to the left. Great job. Yeah, we got our hands on every range resident tracking data set we could in a short period of time. And we did a big comprehensive analysis to really prove, because I developed these methods and a lot of people are like, okay, there's 50 home range estimators on the market. Yours is just one of them. It's like, no, it's not the same. So we did this comparative analysis to really show that
you have to account for the temporal autocorrelation in these tracking data to get good predictions.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Thank you.
Rand Nathan, do you want to jump in next?
Yes, Chris, hello. Yeah, you made so wonderful contribution to the statistical analysis of movement. I just want to say that this distinction between discrete and continuous time analysis of movement is surely very, very important in the times of Argos and other low resolution data, but I think now that we can sample very accurately every second or so, it's not a big issue anymore unless you tell me why it is.
Well, so you want your outputs to be things that are based on a continuous time model, even if you have high resolution data. So if you have location data, something like speed is derived from the time derivative of location. So, and if you don't have a model that you know, has that buried in the model, and you just take like distance divided by time, and you don't like filter out the location errors and whatnot, you're gonna get all kinds of weird things out in the end. And what you really need to estimate something like speed is you just really need a continuous time model and a location error model with high resolution data. So I think the need for that doesn't go away. It's just the benefits change when you go from low resolution to high resolution. And I think, you know, whether or not you're going to have high resolution data on your species and on your taxa really depends a lot. I mean, I think coarse resolution data will always be here. It's just going to be moved to a different taxa. And your taxa will go from coarse resolution to high resolution, but then it becomes someone else's problem down the line. So just kind of fixing that and having an all-encompassing solution, I think is pretty useful. But I'm not against discrete time methods. It's just, you know, when you can have irregular sampling and gaps in the data and all sorts of issues that a lot of people have, I think that's the rule rather than the exception. Then the continuous time methods are just really useful for taking care of that.
Thanks.
All right, I'm going to, there's a couple more questions, Christian, but I think you can pick them up in the chat from Aurora and from Tig as well. So do you want to just have a little look through the chat while Mackenzie is speaking and respond to people there? And we'll
Sure.
pull you back for the discussion in a little bit. Mackenzie, do you want to get your stuff set up and I'll do a little introduction?
Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So Mackenzie Mathis is the Bertarelli Foundation Chair of Integrative Neuroscience and an assistant professor at the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. We're especially excited to hear about her work with DeepLabNet, creating easy to use tools for pose estimations in animals that can be used for behavioral and kinematic analyses. Her team's put a lot of effort into making their work usable by non-ML experts, which enables ecologists and behavioral researchers to analyze data they collect in the wild a lot easier. So we're really excited to hear about your work. Do you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you so much. And you guys can see my screen, the correct one, I guess.
Yep.
Perfect. All right, thank you so much. And thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. So I'm a neuroscientist and I deeply care about measuring behavior. Arguably, we've learned the most that we know about the brain through the study of behavior. So in today's talk, I'm going to have a bit of a different scale, kind of jiving off of Sarah here. These are the large scale data sets about tracking over huge ranges. But what I'm actually interested in terms of trying to understand how the brain generates movement is typically at the scale of individuals or smaller social groups, but capturing really detailed kinematic analyses, so the posture of these animals. And so if we think about behavior broadly, it's extremely diverse, it's very complex. Imagine just having these two zebras who might be playing or they might be fighting for territory. So the simple question is, how can we actually quantify this? If we want to do this non-invasively to capture this behavior, videography is a really great approach. And so from videos, we can really train now deep neural networks to acquire both postural data. Sorry, this is not plain. Postural data, of course, get information about animal identification. And then ultimately, and what we've heard a lot about, we can do this population and even individual movement analysis at the level of different actions or these kinematics. And so just to give you a brief introduction to this, in general, every frame of video captures part or all of the animals. And the goal that we have is to extract from the pixel level these lower dimensional embeddings of the posture themselves. So going from these images and frames to actually this key point representation. And so we can do this with so-called pose estimation algorithms, which I'll delve into a bit more. But ultimately what this gives you is essentially a skeleton that can be used for these downstream tasks, such as looking at kinematics, potentially in relation to neural data, looking at actions, and ultimately going to the level of biomechanics and modeling of these animals at the individual level. And so behavior, as I mentioned, is extremely diverse. So from the lab to the wild, there's a myriad of applications for pose estimation in general, right? You can really think of it as this step to digitize and make this lower dimensional embeddings in your data. So pose estimation became very popular in the late 2010s when deep learning models trained on tens of thousands of images from different humans started to show the level of performance that you would get with traditional methods like motion capture suits. So how your favorite films like Avatar and so forth are actually being made. And so in general, it wasn't very clear from these large scale data sets on humans, you could get this incredible performance, but it wasn't clear at the scale of, say, animal data sets, which are typically much, much smaller, that this was.
Mackenzie, we've just lost sound on you. Is that for everyone?
Yeah.
Is she hearing me?
I don't think so. We can't hear you.
Connecting to audio?
Oh, that's so weird. Did it disconnect me from audio? Okay,
yeah.
So where did you guys hear me? That's so wild. Should I just start again?
It was pretty quick. So maybe just
like
start
15 seconds ago. Yeah.
The roll.
That's so strange.
Yeah.
Okay, so very, very briefly, I will just go through. The short answer is that behavior is super complicated. We want to be able to take these sort of pixel level representations within frames and deduce these down into a lower dimensional embedding, which we call these key point representations, because ultimately what this gives you is a skeleton or a skeletal representation of this data. And these skeletons can be used to do things like kinematic analysis. We've heard a bit about that today. In our context, we want to do this with paired modalities such as neural data, or looking at action spaces of animals, or all the way through to biomechanical modeling of individuals. All right, so behavior is super diverse. As I mentioned, from the lab to the wild, there's a huge range of potential applications. And so when we started in this field, deep learning methods were just showing really good performance on these large scale human data sets. So if you have tens of thousands of labeled frames, it starts to approach like the level of marked motion capture. These are like how you get your Avatar movies in front of the green screen. And so in short, there was a couple different challenges that really have come up over the years when we started working in this. The first bullet point sounds relatively obvious, but animals have really different body plans. So it's not that we could just leverage something like the human skeleton and use this across, right? From cheetahs to even mice in the laboratory. It's not potentially clear how you would map that. It's also not desirable to build tools that only if you have these really large scale data sets, people can use, right? We wanted to make this usable at the small scale, at the level of a laboratory for people. We also, of course, wanted to track behavior in beyond just 2D, so even 3D posture in a single frame. And of course, 4D and beyond behavior is not two-dimensional or not even three-dimensional, to be honest. This has also been touched upon today, but we want it to be fast, right? We want to be able to deploy these things in the real world for real-time, low latency feedback to animals. And we wanted to tackle things like multi-animal tracking, where the animals can look so highly similar, like it's very hard for me to tell apart two black 6 laboratory mice in my group. And we also want to, of course, as Sara nicely mentioned, generalizability. We want to work towards robust solutions. So how do we actually get to that? So when we started working on this problem, our early scientific contribution to the field was to show that we could take models trained on these large-scale data sets for classification and fine-tune them on our target data set for pose estimation. So ImageNet is this incredible data set. I don't have time to talk about all the merits of this beautiful work, but in short, the general idea is if you have a large corpus of data, you train a convolutional neural network to produce the label cat if it gets this image. So what ultimately we wanted to do is say, can we transfer this neural network, build out new deconvolutional heads, and instead of saying cat, we actually just want the key points of this animal. And so that's what became Deep Lab Cut. Thank you for the very nice introduction. But in general, it's not meant just to work on mice or zebras or cheetahs. It is really built as a tool across ecology, life sciences, neuroscience, you name it. So it's been used for things like cancer cell tracking, of course, a lot of experimentation in laboratories. I just want to say it actually has a really big user base, and we really kind of pride ourselves. I mean, it's humbling, but it's amazing to have such a large group of people that are using the tools. And that means also for you, there's help, there's a community. So if you're just diving in, there's a lot of people that are there to assist you. And so, I mean, of course, as I potentially alluded to already, Deep Lab Cut is open source. It's built fully on the Python stack. We take innovations from computer vision. It's deployed on GitHub. We have a lot of interfaces for you to use, GPUs for free from Google if you want to test these things out, because it's much, much faster on this type of hardware. We also provide a lot of tools for large scale computing. So if you want to do distributed computing and at scale, this is possible. I won't talk about this at all today, but there's some like kind of, laboratory specific, neuroscience specific tools to do this in real time. And the really fun thing about being an open source developer, I think it was touched on the last talk, is that people use and build on these tools. So there's a lot of other what I call post-pose estimation packages that allow you to analyze your data in much greater detail, right? Because you can think of this as essentially key points over time. So this is time series analysis. So what I want to do, excuse me, in the last few minutes is kind of give you an example, potentially for this crowd to, I don't know, inspire you or get feedback also from the community. So one of the things that, this is a real-time video, by the way, of a cheetah in a sanctuary in South Africa. And one thing that we want to do in general is enable researchers to ask interesting questions. So we teamed up with Professor Amir Patel's group, where they wanted to build, or they want to build robots that have tails to do better high-speed turns, much like a cheetah. And so with them, in the last few years, we've been working on new methods for doing 3D reconstruction across very consumer-grade cameras and trying to clean up potentially any of the errors that can result from like using these type of GoPro cameras and so forth, with all the distortions, all the potential issues of tracking the fastest land mammal, which of course is very fun. In short, we ended up building a reasonably sized data set to also release to the community with both 2D and 3D data, so they can build on this work as well and try to, we don't always have to have the best models. It's very fun to be in a community that's really active and pushing, but nonetheless, we did come up with some new ways to do this. So this is just a projection of the 3D onto the video, but maybe you can appreciate this more or less in real time. So here's what you essentially get is a cheetah moving through space. Our trajectory optimization method then globally can stitch and optimize the trajectory using kinematic features across time. And so that, of course, is the blue here, and triangulation, just purely using the geometry, would be the red. All right, so, where to get started is sort of the next potential question in a very short talk. But one big thing that kind of presents itself is that, do you want to build your own model, or do you want to use something that's pre-trained? At this point in the community, there are a series of models that are available. I have an animation to remind you that this is from a primer. So if you're just jumping into this field, it's really going from the principles of deep learning all the way through to the pitfalls and perspectives of using these types of tools. But in short, you can think about if you want to build them. Our tool, Deep Lab Cut, is either advanced as you want to be using the CLI interface, or at the same time a fully graphical user interface. It's just point and click. You don't need to know any computer vision or programming to use this, whether that's on your house cat or a cheetah. All right, and so models like the full cheetah, of course, we publicly make these models available. But this is already still in a very particular setting in South Africa with these cameras and these things. So it's not going to just generalize well to other cheetahs like in your local zoo or sanctuary. And so that really brings up the question of like, how do we actually build better pre-trained models? And so one thing that we've kind of contemplated is it seems like a bit of a wasted opportunity, not to mention CO2, if we're not building community-driven models in a way that that can be leveraged by many, many people. And so in life sciences, for example, there's an estimate of either 20 to 100 million black 6 mice used in research every year. And it doesn't make sense for labs to only make neural networks for their own applications. But the problem then arises when someone labels like data set 1, and then you have data set 2 with different key points. And actually how you train these models, I won't get into the details today, but you're often penalizing missing data, or you're not back propagating. You need to differentially back propagate this error from different data sets. And so in short, I've had a really talented PhD student over the last years who's been working on and trying to develop new methods to jointly train across these diverse data sets and get quite, I think, impressive zero-shot performance, meaning this is data that's not included at all in training the model. So this would be, say, if you had a model that you wanted to track these 4 key points, but you didn't have any other annotations of all these other key points, you just fed it into this neural network, this is the type of data that you would get out. So what this means practically, so it's a complicated graph, but MAP, the higher the better. And in the zero-shot setting, you can see a 20 to even 80-fold improvement over, of course, a model that doesn't have this type of initialization, what we call these super animal networks. This doesn't just work for lab mice. We want to build these to be very usable and deployed in the wild, like the real wild. And so we've worked on data sets that have everything from antelopes to zebras to wolves to dogs, to cats, cheetahs, horses, etc. And then we held out some animals based on relatively abnormal shapes, so like elephants and giraffes and rodents, which were never seen in training. And this is what you're seeing is zero-shot performance in this setting. And so, of course, how do we do this? There's some smart training, but also just a lot of data, right? So this has also been alluded to. And so we've been collecting data from a lot of different data sets and including community sourcing this data. So we have this website, we've teamed up with individual researchers. So this is a very large project working on great apes. And so we're hosting the infrastructure for them. So they have an easy web interface to label their data. So this is something that any of you are excited about. This is now quite easy for us to set up. Of course, it's your data. We don't own it. It's for the community. And then these models can be shared very broadly. So I hope in this short talk with some funny technical delays that I've convinced you that pose estimation is quite an interesting way to, as a way to get digitize your data to do behavioral quantification, whether that's in doing kinematics or actions or biomechanics and modeling. Of course, I didn't go through all these things. And as a last note, I wanted to just say I didn't talk about it in today's talk, but we've also looked recently at re-identification of animals purely from this visual data, right? So these are unmarked animals in any way. We've devised new methods to track them and re-ID them. So even if they leave the scene and come back in, of course, we haven't tried this in every crazy setting, so we'd be really happy for the community's feedback, but this was just published in Nature Methods a few weeks ago. So with that, I'd like to thank my incredible team, my long-term collaborator, Alex Mathis, who's really pioneered this work with me. In particular, Maxime Vidal, who works on this contrib module for getting data across people. Xiaokai Yi, who's worked on this model zoo and super animals, and Jesse Lauer, who's one of the Deep Lab head developers. And I would be remiss not to thank my funders, in particular, the Chen Zuckerberg Initiative, who has funded the code development and maintenance, in particular, and supporting the community. So thank you guys so much for your time and looking forward to the discussion.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm very conscious of time, so I'll just allow, okay, there's a lot of questions just dropping in. The first one I'm going to allow, Tony, do you want to jump in?
Hi, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Hi there. That was a great talk. I just had a question about when you did the 3D modeling of the cheetah running, did you use two cameras or was that just off of a single camera?
Yeah, so for that project to build up the data set, we actually had 6 GoPros, but we have worked on methods to lift now from a single camera perspective. Certainly if you have 3D data, you can train a model to just predict 3D from 2D. But what we showed in the paper and the data sets released from 6 camera views, so others can build on top of this work.
Okay, and sorry, just a follow-up question. So
sure.
I saw that you had like the cells, that there was some cell tracking examples that was being used. So
yes,
is this basically transferable to any sort of movement?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it actually doesn't even require movement. It's a frame-by-frame detector, and so in that sense, it can leverage just even information in a frame. So some people use Deep Lab Cut for like fiduciary markers on a wild, like a checkerboard. You could use it for to stabilize the image and calculate an allocentric viewpoint or egocentric if you needed. So there's no particular motion priors that are required for the tracking. Of course, if you have motion tracking data, that can be leveraged by the model as well. So if you have video data, it can be used.
Okay, really cool. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much.
Ran, I think yours is a really interesting question. Do you want to jump in? And then I'm going to ask a big closing question.
Sure.
Ran, yes.
Me? Yeah.
I did. I'm sorry, I didn't give you a 10-second warning, but do you want to jump in?
Sorry, but I think there were several other questions.
No, I think yours is interesting. Could go for it.
Okay. So how we apply all these methods to track wildlife in the wild? That's, I think, the big concerns, and it's quite short. It's quite limited in space. You need lots of infrastructure for the batteries and everything. So what is the most optimistic case for fieldwork in 1 or 2 years?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And of course, my domain expertise doesn't solve all of these problems. So I think maybe I can give two toeholds into the problem. So one is that, of course, there's no a priori limitation at the software stage for tracking over long time scales. So we put up cameras and film like marmosets in quite wild-like environments in a smaller range, but over days, months, weeks, and ultimately we scale up to years. That being said, as you said, these are hardwired cameras with battery, and this is not deployable. And I think someone mentioned, following zebras with a drone is not potentially a great idea, like these types of things. So I don't necessarily see it as like this is going to be the only way ever to do this, or certainly in the next 2 years. What I do think, and what's been brought up, is that this is just another type of data modality that can be used when you have it to do modeling at different scales. So if you have, let's say, a home nest area of eagles and you have that video data at the perch, you can do really interesting behavioral analysis that couldn't be revealed just by these long treks. But at the same time, you can use that to jointly model and get sort of individualistic signatures at a higher resolution. So you might look at probable or like predictive models of saying like, is this bird taking care of its, I don't know, baby bird? Sorry, I'm clearly not an ecologist here. And then try to understand, is that affecting its future fight plans because it's actually spending so much time in the nest versus foraging, right? So I think like that's the type of level analysis that I'd be super optimistic about in the next years. But I think you raise a great question that, there's some hardware limitations that will have to be overcome for all of us to deploy these things at really the scale that we would ultimately like to do this non-invasively.
Guys, I love that there's big discussion happening in the chat, and no, you're good. That was great. There's a big discussion happening in the chat. I realize we're close to time, and we've just been like, you guys have given us such a gift of really meaty talks and really shining a light on where we could be going. And I think I speak for a lot of people and how inspiring they were. And we often get, I think as conservationists, we get stuck thinking very close in the future and thinking very practically about how things can be applied, and very cautious about hype. But it's been so wonderful to hear about actually where we could be going, and to see the tools that you're already developing and thinking so clearly about accessibility and usability for a lot of conservationists and other users. So my wrap-up question, and apologies that we haven't had a discussion, but I feel like a lot of the stuff will be picked up in the next session as well. My final question for everyone I'd love to hear from would be like, what's your #1 development on the horizon that you think would completely revolutionize what we're doing right now? And if you want to throw in a part B to that, what makes you feel optimistic about the future? Sara Beery, do you want to go first?
I think actually I use MoveBank and like the movement ecology community as an example a lot of the time to other like communities in ecology that use different types of data as like this wonderful guiding light of like what is possible when you do kind of work together as a community to build this like shared infrastructure and this shared access to data. And I do really think that like just like looking at how that's made things like the amazing work that that Christen was showing possible in a way, because like he was able to then actually look across all of these different types of species, pull together these things, like test this and understand, is the method we're developing, you know, only valid for some species and not others. And so I think, you know, you guys should all in this community pat yourselves on the back for really like doing that early and doing it reasonably well. And I think I'm quite excited seeing that type of, you know, data ecosystem and this sort of slow shift in the ecological community to like data as being immediately valuable to everyone, as opposed to something that you need to keep and hoard until you've published on it sufficiently. I think the more that we see that changing, like the more I think we're moving towards a space where we can build non-siloed, like large scale understanding about what's going on.
Thanks, Sara. Somayeh, do you want to have a crack at it?
Sure. Yeah, I'm excited with the availability of different types of data sets that we have, both on human side and animal side, and you know, not only movement data, but also environmental data that we have to connect the two and basically use it for prediction. So my future research focuses a lot on prediction of movement and using data integration and data fusion.
Awesome. Christen, do you want to, what do you think is on the horizon and what makes you feel optimistic?
I think, you know, getting all these statistical methods settled where you don't have scale dependencies, where you can compare data that have been sampled at different scales and different types of data, and integrating all those things together. I think there's just a kind of possibility for things that I can't really quite imagine what's going to come out of that. Just anything from like scaling laws to, I don't know. I just think there's a lot of possibilities.
Awesome. Mackenzie, do you want to have the final word?
Oh, that's a big honor. No, I'm excited about a lot. I mean, it's very inspiring to just see the communities coming together. I think Sara captured that really well. And yeah, I'm personally like super excited about multimodal data streams. So I think that is one area that we're working on a lot. And also trying to solve big challenges in, say, dimensionality reduction over continuous data sets, and doing this in robust and have like theoretically guaranteed sort of embedding spaces. So that's kind of the frontier that we're working towards. And I think that this community has like the incredible data sets to do it. So I'll be really happy to talk with others in this space again. Thanks.
I'll wrap us up by saying thank you so much to all of our speakers. They really, the talks were really incredible, and we really appreciate your time joining us today. Final plug, we, as of last week, have launched our new Wild Labs community platform, which is shiny and beautiful and designed. It's taken us 2 years to build, and a lot of wonderful new features are coming in the next few weeks. So we really encourage you to pop on and check it out. And the information and members should be much, much more accessible and easy to use. So do pop on there. We have groups for AI for conservation, biologging, and all sorts of conservation tech groups. So do use that community as well to collaborate and discover the conservation tech world. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We'll see you in 2 weeks. The registration for our next event has just opened up, so do get your ticket and we'll see you back here. Thanks everyone. Have a good rest of your day.